Welcome to the Wine Foundry in Napa Valley, California. We are a boutique family-owned winery specializing in high-end customized winemaking for small commercial brands, private clients, and corporations. We do this with our top-notch vineyard partners and focus these Wine Foundry Wednesdays sessions to explore winemaking and our vineyard partners in the process. For those that don't know, we also have two brands using a lot of these same vineyards and winemaking techniques and philosophies. One is called Anarchist Wine Co., which is centered around fun blends, which buck convention, and then our Foundry Wines, which is our nod to classical styles and interpretations of old and new world varietal favorites. This week, we're going to explore Chardonnay and Pinot Noir from a vineyard we've been sourcing from the last handful of years in the Petaluma Gap. And that vineyard is called Rodgers Creek Vineyard. And we've got a very special guest with us, Randy Luginbill, who is runs that vineyard and knows a lot more about it than the rest of the three of us on the screen. And we're also going to incorporate Patrick so they can kind of go back and forth talking about style and all of that. The goals of this webinar are to familiarize you with Rodgers Creek and why it's ideally suited for top-notch interpretations of Chard and Pinot. We're going to explore the Petaluma Gap AVA a little bit. Patrick's fermentation and aging philosophy on the varietals, and have a little bit of fun. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and get to it.
Hey, Randy, welcome. We're excited that you're joining us tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome everybody, and thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Hey, Randy, you know, you've been in the industry a long time in multiple arenas. Just briefly outline, what was your journey to Rodgers Creek?
Well, I started in the wine and grape industry in 1984 with Robert Mondavi Winery. And
I've heard of
I spent 24 years of my career with Robert Mondavi Winery. And along that route, most of the time it was purchasing grapes for the winery. And in 2000, we were approached by, at that point in time, the developers of Rodgers Creek Vineyard to come up and take a look about possibly buying the grapes. And in 2001, that's what I did. I ended up purchasing quite a few of the grapes off the ranch. And in my travels, ended up going to work for the folks that developed the vineyard and became part of the ownership team. And the journey has taken me now to where we're growing world-class wines and helping you guys make some world-class grapes and helping you guys make some world-class wines up there. So that's my journey to the property.
That is fantastic. Look, the fruit is exceptional. We're honored to work with it. What makes Rodgers Creek Rodgers Creek? You know, what kind of differentiates it from? Look, there's a lot of Chardonnay in Sonoma County. Why Rodgers Creek?
Well, first off, I think the elevation. It's about 600 feet elevation above sea level, and that gives it a little bit of uniqueness, especially even for that area. And then secondly, it is got some soils that are probably there's very few in the North Coast. They're rhyolitic, and rhyolite is it's a rock. That when it erupts from the volcanoes, depending on the eruption, it has different forms. When it's highly explosive in an eruption, it comes out as like tufa. And so I'm sure Steve and Patrick, who've been up to the vineyard, and maybe you too, Stu, have seen how it's kind of a light colored, a toofy colored soil. That's what we have there. That's pretty unique. It's very high in calcium. So because of the calcareous nature of it, it gives a different quality. The pHs of the grapes when they come in and during fermentation are usually a little higher than even just further down in elevation. So that's really unique to that area. And then lastly, being where it's situated in the Petaluma Gap, it's right on the north side of the gap. And when the fog goes through the gap, it condenses. And so we get a lot more moisture, let's say, and it's not quite as much fog. So it really has a cooling effect on the fruit there. So it's just unique just by its geographical location. It's just unique that way.
Yeah, and when we're out there, you kind of get that density in the air, and we love that cool weather because it helps really preserve the acidity. We can get into that a little bit about when Patrick starts talking. What about your viticultural philosophy? What are you guys trying to do when you're growing the fruit?
So we try to work with what the property gives us. As you all know, it's a very steep property, so we have to take that into consideration. We've tried to manage the vineyard to follow the slopes and the aspects and the wind, and try to do all that. And then secondly, we farm 100% sustainable. In fact, we are certified sustainable by the California Sustainable Wine Growers Alliance. And so we try to follow, and we do follow all of the practices that we put into that. So it's try to be good stewards of the land and keep it going for many generations.
You talk about the steepness. There was a funny time. My very first trip out to the vineyard, Patrick and Steve and I went out in the truck, and there just wasn't quite enough room in the cabin anymore. So I got to sit in the bed of the pickup truck with Steve's dog. And I was holding on for dear life the entire time because it was like slope, 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 slope. Just great.
We did still get to finish up at Ernie's Tin Bar afterward for a couple of beers too.
We did. We'll point out Ernie's. We'll point out Ernie's on the map of Petaluma Gap in just a little bit. Steve, did you have anything else you wanted to chime in with or anything?
No. I was just talking about drinking beer. Keep going.
Fantastic. And then you talked about the Petaluma Gap, Patrick. So Petaluma Gap, it started in 2000. I mean, people have been growing there for a long time, and like all of the cool kids on the block, like everyone's wanted to work with Petaluma Gap for the last 15 years, 20 years, but it finally get to be a recognized AVA, a day that will go down in infamy. Actually, December 7th, 2017. Patrick, what makes the Petaluma Gap the Petaluma Gap? How is it different from the Sonoma Coast or Russian River, Carneros, Anderson Valley for that matter? And then has it found its, has the story for Petaluma Gap's kind of character been written?
Those are all good questions.
There's only 7 of them right now.
I do live in Petaluma, and in 2002, I finished Davis and we moved to Petaluma, and I started working for a winery that's in in Petaluma here called Keller Estate, Chardonnay, Pinot, and Syrah, and Pinot Gris. And while I was there, this is 2003 to 06, and I was assistant winemaker there. And while I was there, a group of people got together, including Anna Keller of Keller Estate, to start talking about the Petaluma Gap, and wanted to start in 06. They formed the Petaluma Wine Gap Alliance, and so they've been talking about this for almost 15 years, roughly, trying to get it. I was actually not of the opinion, and still probably am not of the opinion, that they needed necessarily to escape from Sonoma Coast. I'm a huge fan of Sonoma Coast and of coastal Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, particularly up and down, not just in Sonoma Coast, but up and down the coast. And to me, it shows the best of what Pinot Noir and Chardonnay have to offer, coastal influences for sure. So whether you're 2 miles from the coast or 20 or 30 miles, depends on what the Gap does, is it provides a chute of right above the San Pablo Bay, coming from the ocean over, bringing marine air to the whole area. And so what it does is, as Randy mentioned, is a cooling effect for sure. Definitely a wind events every afternoon, much to, as I was mentioning to Randy, much to the chagrin of the afternoon golfers in Petaluma. The wind comes in then, and it makes it for a cooling effect. And so the vines, quite frankly, and Randy and I were talking yesterday or the other day about the the vines, they really kind of struggle in there. It's not a super vigorous site. It makes for very low yields, difficult to make farming financially viable for sure under those conditions because of really the vines, the canes maybe 3 feet, 4 feet on some of the real vigorous vines that really they just barely gets up to the top vine or to the top wire a lot of the times. So you're not talking about very large canopy, very small clusters in general. And so it's just a matter of it struggles a little bit. Usually most experts believe that stress vines make the best wines. And of course, it's the timing of stressing. You don't necessarily want to stress it the whole year long, perhaps, but the site itself, as Randy mentioned, gives for its volcanic soils, and the area in general is very clay-based, clay loam-based in general. Like where I'm in just kind of north and slightly west of where the vineyard is, and I'm on the valley floor, and it is very thick clay, very, very, very heavy kind of, and difficult to work with. As a matter of fact, I don't farm in the ground. I go above the ground in my vegetable garden because it's too hard to work with. And so I'd rather have in the area where you do have some volcanic, more rock or volcanic, it actually provides for less, to me, better. The heavier clays are really difficult to work. Not impossible, but it's just very, very difficult. The other conditions of the actual slope and aspect of it, as Andy mentioned, were some of the difficult logistical aspects of that vineyard. Because as both of you and Randy have all been there, how very, it's not, when you imagine, having to farm it or plant it or drive the tractor, it's all very difficult, and spraying it evenly. Everything is difficult when you're farming, and especially if the ground is not even and the conditions are not uniform, it makes for more difficult. So slopes and different aspects all makes it hard to be steady across the block. And so anyhow, we started working with this in 2016. I'm a big fan of the area. I've worked with fruit right across the street at Sonoma Stage. I worked at Keller Estate is over the hill, maybe a mile or two away, not far. We've worked with San Giacomo fruit from around the area as well. So we really have, I do know the area pretty well. And to your question about what makes Petaluma Gap, I'd say Petaluma Gap is not yet defined, and at least in my eyes, even though I've been working with the fruit for the last 15 years, I still don't think that it has. Sonoma Coast is very distinct, and Russian River, very distinct. Carneros, quite distinct. I don't have that quite yet a complete impression, I think, of what Petaluma Gap only provides necessarily, as opposed to what as I do think it is definitely right in the middle of Sonoma Coast as far as the profile goes. When you go over right to the very, very coast, the true coast, the wines get leaner. They're not quite as lush as you can get inland. And that's definitely, I think, just due to slightly, even though it's cool, it's still warmer than it is along the coast. So Hirsch and Cobb and all the flowers, those are on the I'm pointing that way, that's west. Actually, this way is west for me. Those are on the leaner side. So you can still make reasonably, and it's clonal for Pinot Noir, for everyone that appreciates Pinot knows a clonal difference. So Randy and I think, I'm not sure, but I think you and Steve as well are drinking we got 2 blocks in 19. And so previously I co-fermented the blocks in 16 and 17 and 18. The blocks that we got a couple different blocks. In 19, they came in at a different time, so I actually fermented them separately and kept them separate. And so we have 2 blocks, and the main block is 3C, which is a 667 clone, known for more structure and more weight, a little bit more full body, slightly higher pHs typically, and more tannins than usual. So and depending on the barrel you put it in, a meatier version of Pinot, if you will. Whereas the other block, 4C, is Pommard, and is lighter, it's prettier, it's more feminine, if you will, and more kind of more delicate, slightly more acid. And so using the 3C to blend into the 4C. And so depending on the clients, certain clients want more of that Pommard or prettiness, youthfulness and light fruit, and some people want more weight and texture and more. And so you can add different levels of the, to bring out a little bit more acidity perhaps, or a little bit more redness of fruit. And so, and lightening the weight of the wine overall. So depending on how weighty you want the wine to be, then it's a subjective question. And so,
you brought up two kind of things there. So the one thing we can kind of talk about briefly is clones. So if for those who don't know, and he also mentioned different blocks. So when you plant a vineyard, every area is not done the same. And so what grape growers do is they'll put different interpretations of the grape in different sections. We refer to these as clones. What they've done is they've taken kind of a cutting, and then propagated that cutting, and that clone, if you will, has certain attributes. Patrick talked about 667, which is noted for a little bit more, it's a little more fuerte, a little more stronger, bigger, full-bodied interpretation of Pinot Noir, and then others will be lighter. And so depending on what you're going for at a particular site, you'll make planting choices accordingly. So there's different blocks to vineyards and different clonal selections, which will be planted depending on your goals for how you want to have the interpretation. Now, the Petaluma Gap itself, so why does it have this name? So the coastal range in California runs north to south, okay? So we have a mountain range which runs north to south. But right here, west of Petaluma, there is a gap between two hills, essentially.
Right.
And you see that down by San Francisco. The Golden Gate Bridge is a gap which allows fog to come in and blanket the city. And a snake of fog pushes in over this area west of Petaluma, and it snakes in and settles over through this area, which we've notated as the Petaluma Gap, northern part of northern, what's called Marin County, and this section of southern Sonoma County. And that fog and that kind of push-pull effect every single day really keeps things cool and allows fruit in this section of the valley of Sonoma to really kind of bring on unique characters. Now, Petaluma Gap, Patrick said the story hasn't been told. And it's because it's only been a recognized growing region since 2017. And it's planted to, there's 4,000 acres, about 75% of it is planted to Pinot, about 12% to Chard, 12% to Syrah, and about 1% to insert varietal here, Sauvignon Blanc, or maybe some Petit. There's other maybe Rhone varietals, but a very, very small thing. But that's kind of, Patrick, now when you get the fruit from Randy does a great job in his team are kind of nailing it throughout the year. So when you're approaching harvest, what are you looking for in terms of making your picking decision? And your course of action for it's time to pick now.
Yeah. So challenging, to make picking calls for sure, so you can't go back once you've picked them, there's no going back. Right. And so there's really difficult to note when's the perfect time for these grapes. And you have to take into consideration, logistics, unfortunately, logistics of the vineyard, logistics of the winery. You have to look at that's not the primary one, but that's part of the decision. You're certainly if you were just making it, you had your druthers and you could pick it any time you wanted to. You go out there and you're taking samples and you're looking and you're trying to predict, right? I need to give Randy, anywhere from a few days to a week or more notice that I want to pick. And so I have to be thinking and, and looking at the weather. So it's really a combination of kind of multiple parameters that you have to look at, right? What's happening in the next week or two in the weather patterns. You have to consider what's happened the previous week or two with the grapes. And so you're taking multiple samples, checking the chemistry. Knowing the chemistry kind of gets you in the ballpark area. So I'm looking at numbers to kind of guide my decisions, but not only on the number. I don't pick on a number. I pick on palate and then projecting what I think the grapes will be like. Of course, if I pick them next Tuesday and ferment them this way, a year from now or 8 months from now, 10 months from now, whenever it is, whenever we're tasting it, it's going to be at this stage. And so I like to use analogies for everyone online that is listening to us, that's worked with me. You'll know that I'm analogy man, and I like to be upstream and downstream analogy in this case. Maybe we're at 600 feet upstream of elevation at Rodgers Creek, and we have to decide, of course, through all the processes the things that we're going to do to it. So Stu, you talked on what do we choose, how do we choose to do it? So Chardonnay, generally premium Chardonnay now, is whole cluster pressed, immediately segregated from the skins to minimize the impact of the skins. But that's subjective. So what if you want more skin impact? For example, I think we get plenty of weight on the palate, tannin-wise and texture, that I don't think we're lacking skin impact by doing whole cluster impact. So if the wine was very light though, and you taste it and you're like, I don't really get very much, I'm not really getting a lot, then you probably would have preferred more time on the skins, perhaps, if it was tannins you were looking for. Right? And so the longer, most people now, and back in the day, all wines were made as orange wines, and we talked about in the previous tasting, is that it was made in an orange wine. Everything was made on the skins, all white grapes in wine, white wine and red wine. It's just, you crush up the grapes, and you leave it on the skins, and then you pull it off at some point, or you drink it. So, but you get all the skin impact. And so if you want the skin qualities, and so I don't think you need that in this case. So these are two different blocks that we're working with in this case, two different clones. And they're Dijon clone, French clones. And I don't think that you need, as anyone that's had the wines, several of you I can see that are on the air have had these wines before and have been out to or been to the vineyard and know that these make some reasonably weighty wines, particularly on the barrel that we choose and the blend that we choose. So the newer the barrel, the more the wine is of everything, amplifies the wine. So I like you can shift forward the weight and oakiness and impact by putting it, fermenting it in, because this ferments in the barrel. They're all the different barrels ferment separately. So, right, this is done. There's my hand. Oh, that's Stu's hand. Whose hand is that?
I think it's mine.
I think it's Randy's hand.
It was Randy, yeah.
And
grapes.
We caught him out in the vineyard, just perfect timing there. And so depending on when you pick it, so this, the Chardonnay actually comes in, the Pinot, like a lot of spots, and that might even be picked before the Chardonnay comes in. So they're pretty close, but sometimes you might pick Pinot the week before, a few days before Chardonnay. I'd have to look back. I don't recall off the top of my head what we picked in 19, but we picked some of the Pinot for bubbles. We did a Blanc de Noir last year, if you recall, a Rosé, a Brut Rosé, and that we're doing currently. It's in Tirage. And we picked some of the Pommard early. That's the 3C. Excuse me, that's the 4C rather. Pommard is Clone 4, and it's Block 4. That's how I remember it. And Rodgers Creek. And Block 3C is the 667. So we picked those two separate, and I did ferment. Mark Ellenberger asked a question, and we did ferment in this case in 19. Typically, I actually prefer I really do like to co-ferment. I think that the earlier I can kind of combine things, the better integrated and the faster integrated the wine is. It's very subjective. Winemakers do it differently, though. It's not one answer to that question. In this case, because of logistics and the fruit wasn't ready at the same time, I decided to ferment them separately, and then we'll blend in accordingly. So sometimes logistics come into it, but in general, I'm out there tasting the wine or tasting the grapes and using the previous experience. I picked based on this. A lot of it's intuition, and some of it's numbers and chemistry and looking at the data, but a lot of it's I did this before and I got this result, and I'm going to try to recreate it or adjust if I needed to. So that's...
Hey, Steve, before coming in with more questions, Patrick tossed out a term, co-fermentation. What's co-fermentation?
Well, that's where you're taking fruit from either more than one block or more than one variety and fermenting it together as one lot, as one wine.
That's right. So it's just kind of mixing.
I got it right.
Together. I do. Thank you. Very succinct answer. Any other questions coming in before we move on to the next?
It was a real softball.
Oh, sorry. Steve, what is 2 + 2? Any other
6.
questions that have come in from thank you, our audience before we kind of move into our next phase?
Yeah, we've got a couple here. I'm going to throw them over to Randy.
Sure.
So Gray's asking that he's currently got a Chardonnay from Rodgers Creek, And he complimented Patrick on doing a great job with it. Blah, blah, blah. Patrick's wonderful. And he's curious where the slight green fleck kind of color comes in from that wine. Is it a ripeness contribution or a different contribution? And so when he sees that in a wine, he already knows that he will like it. Is there a specific Chard clone that is doing that? And is it a Wente clone?
And that's the greenness, is that what the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, like kind of a green tint to it, I think.
Yeah. You know, it could be clonal, but I think a lot of that could be the site as well. I think because of the coolness and the dampness of that area, you kind of get a little bit more of that green apple, you know, character and stuff. So I think that may be more site driven than clonal. I think the site kind of trumps some of that characteristic. So that would be my guess.
And so speaking more to color and not flavor, is that just a little bit from the skin?
You know, I'm not sure if that has, I'm not exactly sure if that has a whole lot to do with the site. I mean, Patrick, you could probably talk a little bit that as well. You know?
Well, I mean, I can make up an answer if you want me to, but it wouldn't be very scientific. Yeah. I'm going to say it has something to do with the winemaker and how green he was that day when he was coming in. He might have been green from the night before, perhaps.
I was going to say it was his first harvest, or he'd been hitting the sauce before then. Hey, Steve, like, look, you have this relationship with Randy, and
well, I got one more question for Randy.
Oh, you got another question? Sorry about that.
Yeah, Ed had sent this in because he wasn't sure he was going to be on, but I see that he's on here. How does Rodgers Creek think about sustainability and the practice of managing the vineyard? How does it fit into your daily operations? And he wanted to give a nod to Earth Day and felt it was appropriate to ask the question.
Yeah. So, well, as I said earlier, we are 100% sustainable at Rodgers Creek. We are certified through a third-party inspection through the California Sustainable Wine Grape Alliance. Actually, 100% of our vineyards in the Sonoma coast and Sonoma County are certified. So we do assessments, and then we, you know, kind of work daily and weekly on trying to stick to those assessments of our vineyards. You know, one of the things is like trying to do a lot more cover cropping on the steepness for erosion. We have eliminated glyphosate at this particular vineyard.
Nice, good choice.
What most of the wineries are looking for. So basically, it's just, you just have to use checks and balances at all times, you know, in your daily thought of, okay, how do I go forward? Part of the Alliance and its workbook is that you set goals for yourself. And so you can always measure yourself. I mean, it's like the California grape market is really great. We're blessed that most everything we do can be sustainable if you just practice good farming. Grapes are wonderful that way. So you think about it as stewards of the land and take that as responsibility every day, that you're doing this for the next generation, not for this generation. And that's just that's just our philosophy. So.
Love it.
Steve, how did you, like, you know, we were fortunate to work with Rodgers Creek. And so what do you look for? Like when you're, you know, when trying to figure out what are we going to put in our vineyard guide? And for those who don't know, every year we release a vineyard guide, which has a bunch of, like, you know, the top 20 properties in primarily in Napa, Sonoma, some other allotted growing regions in California. But Steve, what are you looking for to put in? Like, what is going to be spotlighted by the Wine Foundry?
So I like talking about this, Stu. Thank you. It's kind of my favorite time of year when we're putting these things together. We've been fortunate to have great partners the last handful of years, so I haven't had to go out and find new sites. But there are, I don't know, maybe threefold reasons to go in there. One is obviously a site that is going to grow really quality fruit, and a partner you can trust, and those kind of go hand in hand. Randy's absolutely communicative. His whole team is great. They say they're going to do something, they do it. Can't speak highly enough about their organization. And with Rodgers Creek specifically, it was really a no-brainer. I mean, it was kind of it's a allotted site that a lot of people that know Sonoma Coast Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Syrah, but they're contracted out on the Syrah for years and years because Dave Ramey, I think, still has all that. But
We can break kneecaps. I'm from Chicago.
Exactly, we will. Exactly, we'll go Tanya Harding on Dave. But it's an extremely well-reputed name for quality, and specifically we wanted to try to get something that's in the gap but also elevated. And so Rodgers Creek is really, there's only one other property that I know of that has similar elevation and similar slopes, and that would probably be Gap's Crown. But honestly, it's just a lot more fun to work with Randy. And so when the fruit's really kind of even keel, it's great. It's also fortunate for Patrick. He can spend a lot of time there because he passes it twice a day on his way home.
On my way home.
And the views aren't too bad, huh, Patrick?
Oh, no, not too bad. And I can go right to Ernie's Tin Bar right after that too.
Yeah.
And the only problem is trying to access those vines when it's been raining, because it gets a little dicey. Hey, we've got we're going to kind of introduce a poll question, or actually a quiz question, kind of leaning towards the world of Chardonnay. And so today's question is as follows. So white wines, like Chardonnay, may be quote unquote cold stabilized, and in order to A, prevent bottles from cracking from pressure changes due to temperature fluctuation or refrigeration, with 2 periods. White wines can be cold stabilized to kill yeast populations to halt or slow down fermentation. C, to prevent small crystals from forming in bottles. Or D, to ensure the wine will taste the same when served at cool temperatures. So we'll keep that up for a little while. Again, we don't want bottles to crack under pressure from temperature change, like when you put it from, you buy it in a wine shop and then put it in the refrigerator, cold stabilization, to slow down the yeast and halt the yeast population from continuing to continue fermentation, prevent small crystals from forming in bottles, or D, ensure the wines will taste the same at cool temperatures. We're going to kind of shift gears now. We've been working in the vineyard, talking vineyard, and Patrick kind of brought up some of this before, but now we're going to kind of move over to a specific section of winemaking, specifically like cap management and the philosophy. Why don't we start with Chardonnay first, Patrick? So we kind of talked about amazing Chard from this property. What is your fermentation philosophy? So like, we know red wine fermentations, but let's kind of get into whites a little bit. So what's your philosophy on it?
Well, yeah, the philosophy is to, of course, as you said, and it's pretty easy, and I imagine somewhat obvious, is to work with as high quality fruit initially as possible, right? So if you start with really good fruit, and then you can do a number of different things with them. And typically in Burgundy, you barrel ferment Chardonnay. And so you can use a range of ages of oak. It's very subjective, again, depending on how much of the oak impact you want. So you can ferment that same wine in an older barrel or a stainless barrel or a newer barrel, and you're going to get, with the same yeast or with different yeast, and you're going to get a slightly different result, right? And so mostly to do with the amount of oak and oakiness, and or when you stop the fermentation. So of course, the primary fermentation, as I'm sure everyone on the call knows, is when the sugars eat the yeast and create alcohol. Secondary fermentation, or malolactic conversion, is with malic acid, is converted by bacteria to lactic acid, which is a stabilizing reaction. It makes the wine less acidic and more full-bodied, and creamier and weightier through the palate. And so if you want more weight, you probably want some or more or all malolactic conversion. If you want to maintain the acidity and you want it to be more about the brightness of the fruit and not so much weight, or kind of medium to a less, you don't want much of any malolactic. And so it's very subjective, though. Those are general kind of strategies. But as far as Chardonnay, I like it to ferment cold, or reasonably cold, about 60-ish degrees, so 55 to 60 degrees, yeah. Okay. And so sometimes I might let it get to 62 to start off the fermentation, then I want to back it down And so we whole cluster, I mentioned earlier, we get plenty, for anyone that's had that wine knows, you get plenty of tannin and grip on it, even going in a really old barrel, with just going whole cluster press. So I like to take the grapes in early in the morning, and we dump them straight into the number one tool, as anyone that's been with me, the winery with me before knows, is the number one tool in a winery, forklift. And so forklift with, in this case, dumper attachment, dumps it into the press. The press, as everyone knows that's been there, is a bladder press or a membrane press, which is airbag inflates it and squeezes the grapes against the other side of the cylinder, which has holes in it and allows the juice to escape. And it does very gently up to, and I press the wine and the grapes very gently, because I'm trying to be as delicate, if you will, as possible, because I don't think it needs an additional manhandling. And so I'm trying not to add a lot of skin impact. I'm trying to be as gentle as possible. Now, if I felt differently about the grapes, or if I was really trying to get more out of them because the grapes were kind of okay, they didn't have a lot of quality or character, then I might destem the grapes, or might do something slightly different to get more of that. But that's not my judgment usually, or ever actually in this case, on the Rodgers Creek fruit. So, and like most high quality Chardonnay, it's treated this way: picked early in the morning, immediately pressed, goes to a cold tank to settle overnight, and then we pull out all the solids, most of the solids, and then rack them to barrels to be fermented. We'll add a little bit of yeast sometimes for a slightly more predictable result. Maybe have to adjust the acid a teeny bit if necessary, and add a little bit of nutrients for the yeast. And essentially, that's it. Very, very little to no additional things that are done when the grapes are fermented in the barrels. In the cold room, it takes weeks to ferment. It might take a month or so to ferment. Depends on the varietal and the yeast. I mean, and how much we added, and temperature and so forth. But I want it to go nice and slow, and then so of course it foams up inside the barrel. So you have to have like a half-filled barrel, 2/3 filled barrel, and then the foam slightly goes down as the fermentation finishes. And then you decide whether or not you want, depending on the client, whether you want to go through some or all malolactic conversion. And so then we decide to make those decisions, and it's client by client, barrel by barrel decision making. And so, and it all depends on the goal of the wine, right? So the more full bodied you want it to be, the more ml, usually the malolactic you want it to have, and usually the more newer oak you want in there. But again, very subjective. Some of you on the call that are listening might want a lot of them might want a medium or older barrels, because you don't want the new barrel qualities, and you're not looking for it to be buttery, oaky, all full ml aspect. But again, I have to make that decision based on whoever wants the wine and what their client's goal is in that. So anyhow, that's the goal of the Chardonnay. The primary takes upwards of a month. Secondary might take a month or two. And then so we've just, SO2'd the wines a few months back from 19. So this sample that you and four of us are tasting is from, I think Randy's particularly is a composite sample, meaning from the whole lot. Mine was from a once used barrel. And so it depends on the amount of, the sample you take and what you're going for. And so what we generally do is we blend either, in years past, we blended sometimes with Santa Barbara, Courtney's Chardonnay, or we might even blend within the same lot, older barrels into newer barrels, or newer barrels into older barrels, to try to balance out the components that we want to have. And so again, it's a matter of, you might love this wine as is, but want 1% new oak into it, or might want 2% of the older barrel into your newer oak. It just depends on the preferences of the person. So, did I answer your question?
I think you scared away Randy, which is a terrible tragedy. But Patrick, what you've done is you've really done a really good job articulating wine style. So in terms of, if somebody wants a light and lean interpretation or a rich and round interpretation, you can control that in the cellar, and we play with that to execute those individual things. Let's move on to Pinot Noir. So, and I specifically just want to focus in on one aspect of production today, which is called cap management. So for those who have never made wine before, we'll kind of showcase this thing. But basically, for white wines, traditionally now in the modern winosphere, we squeeze the grapes and we ferment just the resulting juice. That's white wine production as we would know about it for the last X, decades. Red wine production is different. What we do is we ferment, we utilize the skins of the grapes to achieve color, more texture, more flavor. And there's different ways to extract those compounds. And we refer to that as cap management, because when Patrick referred to that yeast eating the sugar, it's eating the sugar and it creates carbon dioxide, CO2. And what happens is that gas pushes those skins, where all of our color and flavor is, to the top of the fermentation. All of the juice, the future wine, is at the bottom. How are we going to get color and flavor in that? This cap at the top, we have to push it in. And there's different ways to do that. And one of them is something called a punch down, and another one is called a pump over. So Patrick, there's different philosophies on this. I have, some photos and some video that will be playing in the background, but why punch down or why pump over, or a combination of two? And we have stuff specifically showing you Rodgers Creek in the background while Patrick's talking. Yeah. Well, actually, Patrick actually has,
look at this,
a tool.
Punch down. So yes, as you said, the cap, the CO2, yeast, of course, are just like us. They exhale, they breathe in oxygen, exhale CO2, and all the imagine billions of yeast inside the juice, fermenting, pushing up all the grapes up to the top of the cap. And so the whole time while it's fermenting, the CO2 is pushing up the grapes. So as Stu mentioned, you want to, for extraction purposes, for red wines in general, we're trying to extract, as I talked about the white wines, I'm trying to minimize the skin impact of the, is that you, Steve? And wow, look at that. That's a young Steve.
Less facial hair.
We're trying to minimize the impact on the Chardonnay. In the case of Pinot or of all other reds, we really want to incorporate the skin into the wine. Pinot doesn't have a lot of tannins comparatively compared to Cab or other heavier red varietals. Doesn't have the same kind of tannin quality, so you're not going to get. But you're also, in general, for style, going back to my point about the Chardonnay style, you're generally not trying for the same amount of tannins in the wine. So you are trying to be delicate, or more delicate perhaps on the wine than you would if it was a Cabernet or if it was a bigger red, that you're trying to get even more of those qualities. So the case of open top fermenters, red wines can be fermented in anything. It could be closed system, or it can be completely open. It can ferment in buckets or trash cans or bathtubs or tanks or anything. In the case of Pinot Noir, a lot of specialists in Pinot like to ferment in open top fermenters. Okay, and so they like to utilize punch downs as opposed to, or it may be in combination with, in the case for me, in the combination with pump overs as well. So punch down is literally when you take this any type of device, whether it's pneumatic or manually done, and pushing it down, or your feet. And so a lot of, by the way, for all of you that don't know this, Lucy and the old I Love Lucy episode, when they see Lucy in there and the grapes stepping down on the grapes, everyone thinks she's pressing the grapes, but that's not correct. She's actually doing a punch down, or pigeage, as the French would say, with her feet. So you can use your body to also do the same thing. You can use your hands, or you can use your feet, or maybe Stu uses his head and does the head punch downs. You don't have to utilize. You can use an implement to help you out and push it down. And so fancy places, they might have a pneumatic piston that goes up and down, like you would, and literally just doing the same type of thing to punch down, to push down the cap, which is incorporating the grapes back into the juice, getting more of that skin quality, but also keeping oxygen in there, keeping things a little bit more homogeneous, if you will, and fresher to the fermenting yeast that are below, because yeast are aerobic, and the ferment quickly becomes anaerobic when the cap is blocking out all the oxygen through this. So you want to make sure does not dry out, and you want to keep it in contact to keep everything healthy. And now, whether or not you choose to do, in general, most people believe that doing punch downs as opposed to a pump over, which is taking a pump like a fire hose, taking it from the bottom of the tank and pumping it up over the top of the tank, and standing there and doing, as someone would just usually holding the hose and pumping the juice up over the top. And with that, as you're actually getting a lot more of the extraction from it. So I actually do like to do pump overs on Pinot Noirs, generally in the very beginning, and then do punch downs only. Okay, so I like to do a few pump overs as the ferment is beginning or just started, and then I prefer to switch over to punch downs for Pinot. It's different for other varietals, but for this case, I prefer to do usually some amount of the grapes, whole cluster actually, so don't destem some of the grapes, maybe leave 10 to 20% or 10 to 25% of the grapes on the cluster stems in there, and do, hey, Randy, welcome back.
Sorry about that. We're back.
No, it's okay. You know, Patrick has that effect on a lot of people. So
You know,
it's,
most people go right to sleep. That's the only way.
I didn't estimate the time of the battery of the computer. So.
Hey, Patrick, what I can do is I can show two videos, and hopefully the sound isn't on, and I apologize to everyone for that. So one of them, some of you might have seen, is a harvest video of Rafa, one of our cellar hands, punching down. And hopefully I've turned off the sound of the narrative. The video goes on a long time, but I'll shut it down. So hold on here. Let's pull this one up. And well, sorry.
What are you doing there, Stu? All right.
So Patrick, so like, and first of all, yes, CO2 coming up, but also I don't want to get too geeky here with proteins and stuff like that, but that foam that's coming up.
What is the foam?
Well, we don't want to go too geeky on that, but basically you can kind of see that CO2 breaking through. We don't really need to go down the protein, that there's different levels of foam for different things. But that is that. And then can I show a pump over as well? Is that okay?
Sure.
And Rafa is in charge of cap management, so you're going to be seeing quite a bit of them here as we go. And this fermentation is just about to get started. That's why the cap isn't really going on there. But open top fermenter.
Yep. Yeah, as you said, there's not much cap yet on that particular. So that was probably during. So one of the things, when we pick the grapes on the Pinot, same type of thing on Pinot. I've got to go out there, decide when's it going to be ready, and judge ahead of time, of course, again, because I have to give 48 to 100 hours ahead of time to say, hey, by the way, I want to pick on Wednesday. Can you do it? And he's got to be like, okay, I got to get all my ducks in a row, get all my pickers here, so that we get your fruit on Wednesday in the bins and so forth and so on. So there's a lot of logistics that have to happen, but it starts with the fruit being ready. And so they have to do everything upstream of that to make all the decisions on how much fruit to leave on there, or when to prune, or when to lift the wires up, and all the different things that they would go into farming, right, before I even come into the equation. And so working with high quality vineyards makes it a lot easier to be a winemaker, quite frankly, because you're already you don't have to be, man, Randy, I'm so sorry, you're going to have to cut off half that fruit. It's just not good, and so, or whatever it is. So that if that were the case, it makes things a lot more difficult. And so, but anyhow, the grapes come in, make decisions on how much whole cluster or not I want to include, and then it's 4 or 5 days just at 50 degrees, and it would look like the pump over ferment like that Rafa had the second one, or the second video, because there's not much cap at all. When there's a cap, you see it immediately. It looks somewhat solid. It almost looks like you can walk on it, because it dries out, and you really have to, particularly on those big tanks, you have to use all of your might to get down on it. It's not an easy on a half-ton bin or a 1-ton bin. You can do it a lot easier, and even then, it might still be difficult. But on a 5-ton tank, you have to really use your weight. So it's a challenge, especially when there's whole clusters in there as well. And so this case for the 19, for the 3C, not for the 4C, But for the 3C that you're tasting also, Randy, that was about 20% whole cluster. So I think we had, I don't know, 4 tons and or something like that, or 5 tons. And then of that, a couple tons of it was, 1 or 2 tons was done. A few of the bins were done where I didn't destem them at all. It's just included in there. So I'm going for some of that stem quality. And so it's like the stem also adds greenness or tannins and grip to the palate. Herbaceousness perhaps as well, but in the background kind of thing. As I mentioned, the 4C, the Pommard, did not ferment the same way. I did all destemmed. I'm going for a lighter version and this is a bit touch weightier. And if only thing, I'm going to be restraining it using the Pommard. And so, and to what level does it need restraining? Well, that's very subjective. And so it depends on who is judging. So, but to your point, back to your point about cap fermentation or cap management. So at the beginning, I use for big tanks, we would use pump overs. Because because I want to incorporate, I want to get everything kind of mixed together really well. I need to get all my chemistry. I need to know what the numbers are to see if we need to do any adjustment at all. Typically for Pinot, we might need to add a touch of acid, maybe, or mostly just a little bit of nutrients for the yeast. And sometimes I don't even do, actually at 19, I did native yeast. So I didn't add any yeast at all. Yeast, the Pinot Noir ferments like in 5 days, 4 or 5 days, 6 days at the most. So it ferments just like that. Maybe 9 days, 10 days if it was really slow. And that's very interesting because the other varietals take much, much longer to ferment, and Pinot does not. You can look at it, you go to sleep on it, and it's already dried. So you have to be very careful with it. You have to be very attentive to it during the ferment. Generally, in this case, also for this wine, post-fermentation, we did another week or so on this extended, maybe 9-10 days extended maceration also on the 3C. I got to make sure I say it correctly. On the 3C, not the 4C. But again, it depends on what you're trying to. But cap management, the reason why you would do punch down, back to the original point, versus pump over, is if you're trying to get more or less. So what the pump downs do is more gentle. What the pump overs do is incorporates more. So if I'm going to do some sort of addition, like a nutrient addition or something to the wine, I want to do a pump over on it because I want to get it into all the wine. Whereas if I'm generally just doing it for Pinots, I like to do almost only punch downs. Whereas Cab, I like to do a lot more pump overs and maybe even oxygen interaction. I might actually include oxygen during the ferment to give it more of that. Whereas in Pinot, I don't want to do those sort of things in general too much. And so, cool. Again, those are generalizations. For this case, that's what we did on the 19. And so,
hey, Steve, thank you, Patrick. I think we've got some questions in from the audience. Dr. Ryan?
Yeah, I think Patrick probably just kind of answered Ron's question about whether pump over introduces more oxygen to the must than just a punch down. The answer is correct. Yes, it does. And then a question for Randy. This is from an anonymous attendee, and this is going to show you all that we are as impartial as possible here. And really the pressure's on Randy here to see whether we drop him off video or not, depending on his answer. The question is, how does the Wine Foundry's interpretation of your fruit differ from other winemakers you work with?
Interesting.
Wow, that's a good question. I wouldn't say it differs greatly. I think that I think you do something with it a little different than some of the other wineries. I think you pull out a little bit more of the characteristic of the vineyard itself. I personally, after working with the vineyard for so many years, believe that it really has a minerality characteristic to it, and more a little more earthiness in the same clones that it would show from a different vineyard. So I think you guys pull that out of that, more than some of the other wineries. Also, a lot of the wineries blend, into a bigger blend, so they're not using 100% Rodgers Creek. We do have quite a few that do, but yeah, I think you pull a little bit more of the characteristic of the vineyard out of that, So, and I can tell by listening to you that there's a passion there of doing that too. Thank you.
And then we've got another question as well.
Yeah, so there's actually two more here. Randy, I'll do the quicker answer probably here, but can you name any of the other wineries that buy from you? That's a question from Gray in Virginia.
Yeah, so Sojourn, McCrosty, Judge Hill buy some from us. We do sell quite a bit to a brand called Naomi, if you're recognizing that.
Not familiar.
I've never heard of it.
Go ahead. And
No,
then
I've never heard of them. They're small, they're like very small.
Landmark has been a very good client, and they have been actually buying Chardonnay from the very first vintage and continue to do so. There's 3 or 4 other little ones I can't think of right off the top of my head.
Okay.
I apologize. David Ramey obviously buys Syrah from us up there and does a very nice Syrah. Skylark Vineyards also does some Syrah from up there. So
Landmark as well out there.
Yeah, Landmark does quite a bit of Chardonnay. Did a Rodgers Creek Chardonnay since 2003 from the vineyard. So.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. And then Randy, another question is, it's from Mark in Houston. Can you discuss a little more specifics on viticulture, i.e. deficit water management, pruning weight to yield ratios, and pruning regime? We're going to really geek out here for a minute, and hopefully we don't lose the other rest of
And
the
you have to do it in 4
attendees.
sentences.
That's right. And basically, how do different aspects affect those kind of things?
Yeah. So pruning, the philosophy on pruning is we kind of do it block by block. We're almost 100% cane pruned at this particular vineyard. We find that has more evenness in bud break and yield throughout the year. So that's our regime for pruning. As far as canopy management and that kind of thing, as Patrick was mentioning, it's not a very biggish vineyard, so we have to work pretty diligent to make sure that we get the right amount of growth on the shoots, so that we do have that pruning weight to crop ratio. And it can be very difficult there. So on our water regime, we use pressure bombs and also neutron probes to monitor the soil profile. And so typically in this soil structure, it doesn't hold a lot of water. So we don't really have to deficit irrigate, so to speak. We just follow what our
Pressure bomb
parameters are and try to keep that profile to a certain percentage at all times. So that's kind of our philosophy. I mean, we work pretty hard with all of the wineries if they have specific requirements that they like and need, that we do. And it makes it very challenging up there, because if you've seen the vineyard, you know it's not an easy place to work. And so we just try to stay ahead of it that way and work with the wineries. And it's kind of, you just have to go assess each situation and then go forward. And we don't use a cookie cutter model up there. We really just look at how the blocks are doing and where they're going and the wines that are being made, and try to farm it to those standards.
Yeah, Mark, the question asker was the one I told you about the other day, Randy, about when we saw the bobcat in the vineyard. He was the one. He was there with me checking out the vineyard. He worked with us, and is a long-time friend of ours. And he was out here working a harvest. As we went out to the vineyard to check on things, and then we're like, "Hey, there's a bobcat!" And so he got some shots of the. But I'm glad you mentioned because as I mentioned earlier too, the soil profile is different, even though it's not very far, literally on the map from a couple other spots. It's way less clay in those soils than there are on the ground. Yes. And so on the valley floor, and even on the rolling hills around there. So this is way more. So as you mentioned earlier, and you mentioned to me, it's on the Rodgers Creek fault itself. Yes. And so there's a fault right there. It's volcanic from previously, and this is why all that tufa is there in the soil, and it allows. And you see, and again, a couple of other clients have been there with me to see the rockiness of the soil, and as you said, the calcium heavy soils. And so what it does though is it makes it for more minerality. I think it brings in more complexity everyone's going for the B word in Chardonnay, the Burgundy and Pinot too, the B word, and or balance or Burgundy, or maybe there's some other B word, I don't know, but
Yeah.
there are in general. I think I appreciate that you liked the bringing out some of those. To me, the site is important, and right, because I can make a wine to try to make it taste different than what the site would naturally bring. But to me, that's not what I think most people want. They want to bring out what's there and try to bring the best of it. And so, yeah, I really do like the site quite a bit. As I said, it's not just because I'm a Petaluma guy. It's also because it brings out some Burgundy qualities that, anyhow. So is there, Stu, do you have any other questions for Randy that you could?
No, Steve.
I was just going to say we got one more, and then I was just going to tell folks that we all decided earlier that we'll stay on after for any additional questions. But
yeah,
just one more question for you, Randy. How do you, as a grower, brand the Vineyard? It seems to be a trend these days. Is that important to you, or is the winery's brand more important?
For Rodgers Creek, it's important that we brand it. It's a vineyard that is very low yielding. So as Patrick mentioned, it's a challenge to be successful in the economic side of this vineyard. So yeah, branding is important. And it's one of the things that I always try to approach it with people as if yourself, that we can get people that really want to look at the vineyard and its attributes and try to establish a very nice base for that, and do things like this to sell the vineyard. So yes, it is part of the vineyard. Our philosophy of the vineyard, that we do want to brand it in that way. So I mean, that's one of the things with working with Landmark and David Ramey for all the years that they've been there through the duration. And that's part of it, is that it has a history, it has a uniqueness, and we want to continue to grow on that.
Hey, Randy, thank you so much. Hey, about a long time ago in a galaxy, that's a spiral galaxy, a galaxy far, far away, we introduced like a little quiz question tonight,
Oh, yeah.
which was the term cold stabilization in white wine. And the four possible answers were that prevents the bottles from cracking when temperature changes. Cold stabilization is used to kill the yeast population to halt fermentation. It is to prevent small crystals from forming in bottles. Or D, to ensure that wines will taste the same when served at cool temperatures. The actual answer is C. Because certain acids are not stable, if put under cold temperatures, what will happen is they'll bind together and form little crystals. It won't really change anything, but it can be very unsightly when you are picking up the glass, and some people might think there is broken glass shards, pun completely intended, in the glass. Hey, Randy, we want to thank you. We're going to introduce you to one more person from our staff. Sure. Steve, let's bring in our Claire here. Let's see if we can get you on video. Claire, can you launch your video, please?
Great. And then just to remind everybody that Randy and Patrick have agreed to stay on for a few minutes, not to take up too much more of their time this evening, but we will be happy to answer some more questions for anybody that wants to stay on. But I do want to introduce Claire Garibaldi from our team at the Wine Foundry. I see that there's a lot of clients on here. There you go. And Claire, just trying to, everybody's socially distanced. I'm obviously standing next to my bar. Stu's in his record collection, and Patrick's probably in his wife's office. And it looks like Randy's at home as well. So thought it would be nice to introduce you folks to some other team members and familiar faces on our squad at the Wine Foundry. So Claire, she does a number of things for us. Shipping logistics is originally where she was hired. However, she does a lot of things on our brand, our e-commerce, works a lot with the Wine Foundry Guild members. So Claire, can I ask you, why did you come to the Wine Foundry, considering you were originally moving from Savannah, so not even necessarily the Wine Foundry, but the wine industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everybody, first of all. So I guess it all starts with my family are grape growers. We have a vineyard up in northern Alexander Valley, just outside of the town of Cloverdale. And so, of course, viticulture has always been a part of my life. And as Steve mentioned, I had been living in Savannah for some time and was looking toward coming back to California, and wanted to be involved in the wine industry, you know, beyond just viticulture. And so that was my intention in when I found the Wine Foundry, and I ultimately wanted to am starting a small wine brand for myself. And so I knew how important it was to learn every facet of the wine industry, and the Wine Foundry so far has been that.
So far.
It's been a great,
So far.
So far, we'll see. I'm still testing it out 2 years later. Yeah, it's been a great opportunity to see so much of the industry beyond just the viticulture. I mean, there's so many nuances to this, and that's how I ended up here.
It's interesting, actually, because Claire originally applied for a production role with the winery, and I don't normally interview people on their first roll through. Some other folks on our team that are maybe better at sort of pegging these people, and then they bring me in later to talk to them. But Philip and Sharath met with Claire initially, and decided that maybe she was a better fit for what she's doing now, and then what she's actually grown into. So out of that, Claire, I'd just ask you really quickly, what would you say the biggest question or challenge you hear most from people that are launching a brand? We have a lot of small brand owners, and we're known as an incubator for small brands. We've got a lot of them on the call today. So what would you say you find are the biggest kind of challenges or questions that they bring to you?
Yeah, so as Steve mentioned, I'm very involved with e-commerce, specifically as it relates to our guild program. And so I see brands that are just starting, I see those that are doing really well, and I see those that are still kind of trying to figure it out. And it's been very eye-opening for me. I noticed that a big part of it is the wine industry is competitive, right? I mean, you go to the store, and this is just a store. This isn't even just all brands like that you can order online. There are so many of them. And so how do you compete with that? And so you really have to kind of hone in on your story and set yourself apart and be able to communicate that and kind of have your elevator pitch down. And that takes a lot of thought, and that, yeah, it can be challenging, but yeah, it just takes a little bit of time. I also noticed that when people want to engage with your brand, you want to maintain communication with them, right? You want to, they like you for a reason, right? And so if you can have sort of a streamlined process of how you can communicate with them on a regular basis and keep that consistent, keep it very brand centric, ultimately you will be more likely to succeed in having a small wine brand. And another thing that I'm learning myself very much right now is, and like I mentioned, was a big motivator for why I entered into this profession at all, is you have to take the initiative and learn everything you can. I mean, never stop learning. It can be as simple as, what does a case of wine weigh? I mean, that all factors into shipping, and what does it cost? I mean, you might be buying the most heaviest, beautiful glass in the world, but be prepared for what that means down the road. And something else that was really cool today, I got to go check out a press check for one of the labels that we're printing today. And I mean, that was amazing. You wouldn't believe all of the little details that go into printing a wine label. And And that's just one tiny piece of this big picture of how you have a wine brand. It's pretty incredible.
Awesome. So Claire, as she mentioned, she is going to be launching a brand called Eugene Claire in the coming months. She's currently got Petit Syrah and Cabernet in the cellar. And is it going to be those two wines, or are you adding anything more?
I am making a blend as well. The components specifically are TBD, but I'd like to, in what I've been exposed to in this position with the Wine Foundry is how important the art of blending is, thanks to Patrick. And it's really fun. Everybody blends. We all create, everybody puts a little bit, if it's a little 1% of something, it's there. And so I think it's really fun to kind of take that a step further. And so, a third blend would be great.
Awesome. Cool. Well, you can follow Claire and Eugene Claire on Instagram as Eugene Claire.
Eugene Claire Wine. And if you want to drop me an email, taste@eugeneclaire.com, you can always catch me there as well.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. And then I'm gonna go ahead and kind of close things out here, but like I said, we will stay on for a few minutes if anybody has any additional questions. Thanks a lot for joining us for Wine Foundry Wednesdays with Randy Luginbill. Randy, we greatly appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
Have you done a lot of these Zoom calls?
Not like this. I've been doing a lot of Zoom, but it's been mostly with the wine growing organizations that we're, partnered with. So thank you very much for this. So,
well, it's great.
Meet in the Vineyard next time.
Absolutely, gladly. Yeah, there's definitely 6 feet apart that we can find there, no matter what.
Right.
So
right.
That'd be good. So thank you, everybody. Tomorrow night, actually, if anybody's a speed reader, we are launching our Wine Foundry book club, where we're featuring a book called Amber Revolution and finding different ways to connect. Friday, we'll be doing Anarchist Wine Co. and Foundry Wines, second session of Romeo and Juliet, Uncommon Blends with Storybook Results. And whether you have the wines or not, you're welcome to join. You can find that information on the virtual tastings page of anarchistwineco.com. We are also about a week out from shipping our wine club, our spring wine club shipment for Anarchist Wine Co. So if you'd like to get in on that, you can go to Anarchist Wine Co. and sign up for the club as well, or shoot us an email. Other than that, next week we will be back for Wine Foundry Wednesdays with Jan Krupp, the founder and former owner of Stagecoach Vineyards, talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Petit Verdot, and really kind of the history and lore of that vineyard. So Randy, again, thank you so very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. It's really this is probably the most time that you and I have spent face to face or camera to camera at least in a few years. It's usually just over the phone.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And Stu, do you have anything else you need to finish up with?
That's it. Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Well, I guess with that, we will go ahead and stop the recording here. And if anybody wants to stay on, we're happy to answer some more questions. And if not, we'll just stand here drinking.
Yeah, we've broken a record for the longest time on camera. If anybody has anything else, what looks like.